Okay. We have a couple questions here, and I guess I'll start with Jennifer. Um, she asked, from an economic-based planning process point of view, given that taxes are an important fixed expense, do you typically run tax scenarios to obtain the input first, then develop a cash flow projection, then develop the PV? This is how I find myself handling it. I feel like conventional planning doesn't focus on spending first. Curious about the practice management realty.
Well, so the spending and the taxes can't be done independent of the other. You can't kind of figure out the taxes and then figure out the spending, because how much you can spend depends on the taxes, but what the taxes are depends on what your spending is going to be. So these things are chicken and egg. It's a chicken and egg problem, what economists call a simultaneity problem. So they both have to be figured out jointly, in unison, under the hood. So our taxes are perfectly consistent with the taxable income that the household has, and the taxable income depends on how much assets they have, and the assets depend on how much saving they've been doing and how much spending they've been doing. So it's not like you can do one thing by itself and then move on to the second thing and then move on to the third thing, which is kind of implied by your question. Rather, you have to do everything at once. And that's what, and the program does it in a half a second. It gets this right in a half a second. So that's why it took 27 years to get straight. It's not an easy problem to make sure these programs are, the way that the algorithm works is that we have three what are called dynamic programming problems that are iterating back and forth, going back and forth, passing data from one to the other, each doing its calculation, assuming the data that it received from the other program is correct, and then feeding its results to the other two programs. So they're going back and forth many, many times until they converge on a set of answers that are mutually consistent. That's how we economists solve these kinds of chicken and egg problems or simultaneity problems. It's like if you go back to high school algebra, x is a very nonlinear function of y is a nonlinear function of x. You can't substitute out y for x and plug that into the equation and just have an equation in y in x and then solve it. You have to you can't do it that way. You have to iterate back and forth, in effect, guess the answer, come up with new answers, use that to update your guesses, and end up with a solution that's internally consistent.
Okay, let's move to the next question. Here's a question from Cade. What do you do with clients that want to leave money to children but don't know the amount, but don't know the specific amount, just want to leave what is left over?
Well, so the program allows you to, let me just go back to the base profile and to the inputs here. The program lets you specify, for example, special expenses that you might want to enter. You can just click restore here and enter a gift to your kids when you're 90. So you can save up to leave money for your kids. You can enter a reserve fund, money that you don't want to touch and don't want to spend, and that would be left for the kids. You could enter a bequest that you would make to the kids no matter when you die. That might trigger life insurance requirements as well. So there's lots of ways to kind of look after the kids. The program is trying to help you make it not a random event, how much you leave to your kids. You can also think about giving money to the kids right now and seeing how much you can give them such that you'll be comfortable on your own and not make your kids into an insurance company. Because if you are waiting to see how much money you have left over, then if you get into trouble, then the kids get less. If you die young, the kids get more. So now they're kind of at risk, and you're at risk. You've made them into your insurance company. Maybe it's better for you to buy a long-term care policy. Maybe it's better for you to invest in safe assets so that you're not risking their future. And maybe they need the money now. So you can explore lots of different ways of interacting with the kids through the software. And we're here to help you. We have great customer support. And Alex and I have done lots of webinars with planners and dealt with all kinds of different questions. And so if you have a particular client who's got concerns about their children's future and how to handle it, well, we're here to help.
Okay, let's take a question from Bill here. He asked, how would you handle job uncertainty? Run several plans for different job scenarios. How would you handle that?
Yeah, for right now, you would set up alternative profiles. Come up here and add a new profile and call it, lose my job in 5 years, or don't get lose my job this year because everybody's being fired, and not get it back for 3 years. So alternative profiles is one way to look at this. We do have, as you'll, if you look at the webinar I'm going to give tomorrow, or if you attend it, you'll see how we're handling portfolio uncertainty. In other words, randomness in terms of the rates of return that you're going to earn given how you're holding your assets. But in the future, down the road, we're going to be incorporating labor income uncertainty in pretty much the same way that we're handling portfolio return uncertainty. And there's no reason we can't show you the variability of your living standard given the uncertainty that your client has, or the client's variability of their living standard given the uncertainty about the client's future labor income. That's something that a good software program should be able to expose. And we're not there yet, but we're not too far away from incorporating that. But for right now, doing alternative profiles is the right answer.
Okay, here's a question from Melinda. Did you discuss the portfolio asset allocation assumptions to arrive at the sufficient return needed to meet stable consumption?
Okay, so right now we're assuming, let me go back to the reports here. So our software is set up to do the base plan and the robo optimization here. And also you can put in alternative profiles and manually trying to optimize. All that is based on an assumed safe rate of return. Now, the long run return on TIPS right now, in Treasury inflation protected securities, inflation index bonds, is 0. So we have incorporated that in our default assumptions, that the inflation rate's 1.5 and the safe rate of return is 1.5. So that's a 0 real return. That's the reality of the market these days right now. And what we're saying is, we think what one should do is to do planning with a client based on a for sure safe rate of return. And hopefully it's, I think we recommend using the one that's prevailing in the market, the long-term safe rate of return. And then if the client wants to take on some portfolio risk, then do the Montecarlo risk analysis, which is this other report right here, which I'll be talking about tomorrow. And again, you're all invited to come to that webinar, or you can see it online just by clicking on it in a few days once we post it. So I hope that answers the question. Maybe, Alex, you want to just repeat that question one more time just to make sure I didn't miss any part of it.
What basically the question was, how are you forming the assumptions of the rate of return and the inflation rate?
Yeah, well, we're looking at the market. We're trying to do kind of a safety first, for sure, fiduciarily appropriate initial analysis. What's your, given your resources, how can we get you to a smooth living standard as, to the extent possible? What's your borrowing constraints that you're facing, your cash constraints? Now, what can we do to safely raise your living standard? Should we do a Roth conversion? Should we have you put more money into Roths? Should you contribute more to your 401k? Should you retire later? Should you downsize your home? Should you prepay your mortgage? Should you move to a state that has no income tax? All those things are what if scenarios, alternative profile scenarios that can very quickly raise your client's living standard quite substantially, just like we raised this client's living standard by Janet and Jeff's client living standard by $500,000 in less than a second. So that's part of what the software can do, and that's saying, okay, let's, without putting the client in any portfolio risk, let's see if we can get them some alpha. Let's see if we can raise their, for sure, living standard. And then, because there's no risk associated with taking Social Security at 70 versus at 65. I mean, there's, you might say, well, they're going to cut benefits possibly in the future. Well, they're not going to cut them for people who waited till 70 compared to people that took them at 65. That's just not politically in the cards. So that's not an issue. So there's no real risk associated with just waiting to do that, or taking your retirement account money a little bit later than earlier. So the third thing then is the Monte Carlo risk analysis. That's where the client does engage in risky investing, and there we are, showing the living standard outcomes that may arise if the person's investing in risk. We show the level and spread of the client's living standard based on how they're investing. And we show that if they invest in riskier ways, there's a bigger upside and there's also a bigger downside. But the assumption is that the client's adjusting their spending every year. They're not just sitting back and spending their targeted amount year in and year out, even if the stock market falls by 86% as it did in the 1930s. They are adjusting every year, as economics says they should do, in response to whether their assets have done well or poorly, and that gives rise to this kind of distribution of living standard outcomes, these trajectories of living standard outcomes, which we're going to talk about tomorrow, and you'll see then how we process all that information in what's called an expected utility, lifetime expected utility calculation. Expected here means average lifetime utility, average happiness. And we're in effect able to summarize all these possible outcomes in one number and say, okay, look, here's the number for the 50-50 investment strategy. Here's the number for a 20-80 strategy. Here's a number for 80-20 strategy. You tell us your risk aversion coefficient, and we'll tell you which of these numbers is highest. And this is a way of using economics to figure out the optimal portfolio for the client. So if you look at Bob Merton's work or any of the top finance people in the country who've won the Nobel Prize in economics and finance, they've all done expected utility maximization and showed how you can use that to figure out the optimal portfolio for the client. Well, this is the only software that actually does this, that actually really calculates expected lifetime utility and then compares it across different investment strategies.
Okay, let's take another question from Maureen here. It says, how do you incorporate leisure time constraint in economic-based planning? When clients are working pre-retirement, they may not have the time to spend the discretionary income.
Oh, Well, I would say that's a good point. If they're working really hard and they don't have time to take, let's say, a vacation, well, what they could do is specify that vacation as a special expense, so they can come down here and say, hey, I want to have a trip around the world, and it's going to not tax related. It's going to cost 50,000, maybe it's $75,000, and it's going to start in 4 years, and it's going to go for a year, and you enter that, then you save that, and now that becomes part of your plan, and the program will have you save up for that expensive trip around the world when you're retired, and it's going to naturally lower your spending before you hit 2024, so that you'll have enough money to afford this trip. So this is exactly doing what you just said, which is, how do you deal with getting the client to adjust their, do their spending when they can, not when they can't. Right now they're working full time. They don't have the time to enjoy life, to have that extra leisure, but they do have to save up for this trip. Another thing they might want to do is to say, look, right now we really don't have the time to, let me just click on this. We don't have the time to enjoy ourselves, but after we are retired, starting in, let's say when we're 60, when Janet's 65, we're going to make this 120, and we're going to just grow this and keep it constant at 120 for the rest of their days. So now the program is going to know this couple wants to consume 20% more once they retire every year. Or they may want to consume 20% more for a while and then have it starting when Janet is 85. Maybe they want it to fall by negative 2% a year for the rest of their life. And now you see that it goes back down. So we are letting users specify the profile of the living standard, but we're finding the level of the living standard that's affordable, that's within the lifetime budget constraint. And we also make sure that this does not violate any cash flow constraint. Somebody might want to consume, so much, maybe they want to make this 180 right now for the next 10 years, consume a whole lot now and a whole lot less later on. Make that 180 and then have this be at like 40 from that point on, for whatever reason. But if their money is coming in the future, their Social Security benefits or their withdrawals from their retirement accounts, well, they're not going to be able to consume that much more in the short run, because that would require going into debt. That would require them borrowing against their future Social Security benefits or their future retirement account withdrawals. So consequently, the program will try and achieve this pattern, but will not, to the extent possible, but will never put them into debt to do so, if you follow my drift.
Here's a question from Brandy. How do you deal with health events later in life or increased cost of healthcare that is a much higher inflation than typical inflation?
That's a very good point. I think what I would do is enter that under a special expense. Here, I put in like an episode of maybe a nursing home. So it might be a nursing home episode. Maybe it's going to be 125,000 a year, starting. Maybe it's going to be starting in 2040 and continue until first, 2060, whatever, 20-year episode, whatever you think is reasonable. Maybe it's a 5-year episode. And the program will have you save up for that nursing home event. So that's self-insurance. The alternative is to go buy a long-term care policy, in which case you'd still have you would specify in the program a couple things. One is the annual amount would be smaller because it would be net of the payment from the insurance company. So you have to do a little side calculation to figure out how much the insurance company would be paying towards that 125,000 and put that amount in here. And then if you're going to buy that policy right away, you'd want to lower your regular assets because you're going to have to take money out of this $100,000 and spend 20,000 or 50,000 on this nursing home policy. So you can do that as an alternative profile. Then you can compare that with the self-insurance case and then look at the lifetime spending and the annual spending under each alternative and figure out which one seems to be better. Which one makes sense? Is the life insurance, the long-term care policy so expensive in terms of premiums that and the premiums, by the way, may be one time where you reduce your regular assets, or they may be ongoing, in which case you have to put in the premiums as a special expense right up to the point where the nursing home experience arises. So there's different ways that you can buy policies. It might be a one-time payment or an ongoing payment. One-time payment, you just reduce your regular assets or treat that as a one-time special expense. Ongoing payment, you treat that as an ongoing special expense. But the main thing is you have the the cost and the benefit, and then you'd have the profile. And then you compare that profile with the profile where you self-insure, and then you make the comparison. It may be, it certainly is for a lot of people, that they view long-term care insurance as too expensive. And then there's also the issue of whether or not the insurance company will pay off, or whether their small print is going to, in the end, preclude you from actually collecting on this policy that you've been paying for years. Because these insurance companies are not your friends, basically. They're out to rip you off to some extent, because the policies are very complicated, unless you can find one that's pretty straightforward with a reputable insurance company, sold to you by a reputable agent who really knows these policies backwards and forwards. Then it's a much safer proposition. But having had my mom in an assisted living facility and having had home health care insurance for her, I must say that there were some issues about whether or not they really were doing what the policy said they were supposed to do. But in the end, it was a good thing that we bought the policy. So I'm glad we did. It did help us quite a bit. So I'm of mixed views about whether or not long-term care is a good investment. I think if you can sleep better at night, maybe it is a better investment than trying to self-insure.
Okay, we have two questions left here, both from Cade. She says 0% real rate of return seems unrealistic. Why not include the risk clients are willing to take into the calculation? Maybe you want to mention how you can actually adjust, the rate of return and the inflation rate under settings and assumptions.
Yeah. So first of all, you can come in here and make the nominal rate of return. You can make it 10% if you want. So, I mean, we're going to yell at you, but it's going to go through. It's going to work. We're trying to be cautious as default in terms of default. But if you think it's too conservative, unrealistically low, you're free to set a higher number. And then, in addition, in the risk analysis, you can look at if somebody's investing, let's say 50-50 stocks and bonds. Well, if they spend through time as if they're going to earn a zero real return, on average, as I'll show tomorrow, their living standard will be higher in the future because they've been very careful early on, because on average, they're going to get the market return on stocks, which has historically been, around 6% or so real adjusted for inflation. So, this is this part of the program is kind of being very, very cautious, saying let's just figure out a safety first strategy. Let's try and get you all the alpha we can, figure out all the safe ways to raise your living standard without any risk, and then let's look at you're putting some money in the market at risk, and seeing how much you're willing to tolerate, how much money you want to put in the market, what percentage of your assets, how risk tolerant are you, by showing you the range of outcomes, but also by trying to summarize in a single number your average happiness from investing in that manner.
Yeah, and I think we only have one question left, and this is Cade's original question, and I think it's just slightly different than the last question. But the question is, why not include any sort of rate of return or the Monte Carlo within the estimate of lifetime discretionary spending? It appears to negate the ability to show how saving and investing improves the number over time.
Oh, no, as you'll see when you look at this webinar that I'm giving, the more cautiously you spend, the higher, in other words, the more you save and less you spend in the short run, the higher your living standard will be on average in the future. So I don't think we're negating at all. We're showing exactly what happens. If you spend conservatively, you're going to have less downside risk and more upside risks down the road. If you spend aggressively, it will be just the opposite. Same thing with investing. If you invest aggressively, more downside risk, but also more upside risk. If you invest cautiously, less downside, less upside. So all that gets exposed in our Monte Carlo living standard analysis. But right here, we're just trying to focus on kind of the basics and then move on to the risk analysis. So I hope that's clear, but happy to chat with you offline, Kate, about if this explanation hasn't been clear. Feel free to be in touch. Just look off at Gmail. Just give me a shout.
And similarly, my email again is alex@economicsecurityplanning.com. So that appears to be the end of the questions. I just want to thank everyone for being here. And like I said, if you have any questions, feel free to email me or Larry. And also, we'll be sending out an email with the recording and the slides shortly. So thank you so much, everyone.
Yeah, thanks again, and everybody stay safe. Take care. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.